What's going on, guys? This is Robin. In this video, we're going to cover a story where Spider-Man kills everyone. And this story is amazing. I love this story so much. It is dark. It's like the darkest Spider-Man story ever. Although I imagine Kraven's Last Hunt might really take the cake. For those of you guys who are experienced with Spider-Man reading when we're done with this, let me know which one of the two you think is darker. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with our Spider-Verse coverage up to this point, because I imagine we might gain a little bit of traction based on the popularity of the trailer, which is releasing tonight at 8:30 p.m. at the time that I'm recording this video, the Edge of Spider-Verse event was part of the larger Spider-Verse story, right? Where you had a whole bunch of different Spider-Man from across the multiverse who were teaming up against a group called the Inheritors. Edge of Spider-Verse basically gave us these little stories dealing with different Spider-Men from across the multiverse, some of whom actually survived into the main Spider-Verse event, and some of whom did not for various reasons. This one actually picks up with a kid named Patton Parnell instead of Peter Parker, the traditional name. And right off the bat, right off the bat, Clayton McLeod, the guy who wrote this story, basically shows us that this kid is dark, right? Like, he finds an ant, uses a magnifying glass, and basically kills the thing. But one of the things about this is he's not like some, 6-year-old kid who does it out of curiosity or something like that. He actually is showing signs of psychopathy, if not sociopathy, right? Like antisocial personality disorder, a sociopath or a psychopath, right? The idea of harming things that are basically defenseless. That's really the kind of air that he puts off. More so than that, though, it doesn't really seem to be done out of malice or cruelty. It really seems to be done more out of curiosity. And that's one of the big differences between Peter and like a traditional psychopath or a traditional sociopath, is that he doesn't really have a desire to harm people for the sake of doing it. It's really more of like a science experiment than anything else. And so what he actually ends up doing, or at least in this time when he's in his room, he's got a pair of binoculars, and he's basically spying on a girl named Sarah Jane, who is in effect Mary Jane Watson, right? Just by a different name. And it's one of these things where he actually refers to her as as an experiment of sorts. So right there, you've got a kind of detachment, right? Where he doesn't necessarily see himself as being a human despite living among humans, right? Like being a human himself, that he sees himself as kind of different. Now, this has become hugely important once you get to like the traditional mythos as far as Spider-Man goes and all that kind of stuff. But the way that he speaks here is like commencing surveillance experiment stakeout number 16, right? Subject remains unaware of being under observation. Perfect. So he's basically spying on her as she's getting undressed, right? He's like, I must collect samples from subject's living area for analysis, right? And then at that point, his uncle basically starts shouting at him and telling him, he's got to drive him to school and all that kind of stuff. But once he gets there, of course, again, his interactions with Mary Jane Watson, and we're just going to go ahead and call her that, right? We're going to call him Peter Parker. We're going to call her Mary Jane Watson. We're going to keep it simple here, right? I mean, they are alternate reality characters. They do have their alternate reality names, but they're by all standards of measurement, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson, right? So we'll just go ahead and call them that. So basically, Mary Jane kind of asked Peter Parker to sit down next to him, right? Now, on the surface, this is not a very big thing, but for those of you guys who come from a background of being like socially awkward or lacking the kind of social skills necessary to talk to girls, this is something that's kind of huge, right? I mean, I used to be a socially awkward guy back in the day, if you can believe it or not. When I say back in the day, I mean like when I first started middle school, right? Like I'd say within like a year or two of middle school, I was awesome. But up until that point, I was kind of socially awkward, right? But the thing about this is that if you come from that kind of background, you understand the struggle of like just striking up a conversation with a person in general, let alone a girl you like, right? The idea behind this is they're basically going to a place called Alcorp, right? Which is basically this kind of what you would normally expect with Peter Parker receiving his radioactive spider bite, right? In that particular location. And that's exactly what happens. Now, of course, as you also expect, if you're familiar with the existing Spider-Man mythos, Mary Jane Watson's basically in with Flash Thompson. Now, it didn't historically work this way, but it's one of the things where it's basically the love interest of Peter Parker is dating the school bully, right? And so because of that, one of the things to know, and this is something that I think a lot of young people struggle with, why do girls like bullies? Or why do girls like guys who are jerks? Because they exude confidence, man. Like they're some of the most confident people you're ever going to find. And one of the things that you will learn over the course of your life is confidence is key, right? Like you don't even have to be confident. You just need to look confident, right? But like confidence will get you where you want to be in this world, right? Believing in yourself. And so one of the things that's kind of given here, and even one of the things that Mary Jane Watson discusses is this idea that this institution, right? Alcorp is basically a place where they like experiment on animals. They conduct a lot of heinous research here, right? A lot of terrible, terrible things, all in the pursuit of science. And so one of the crazy things about this is that unlike days past, when Peter was more of the curious one, right? The one who would stray off the beaten path in order to find his own way, or to kind of go into that room and feel, to kind of see what's going on. What you actually get here here is Mary Jane Watson that leads him into a restricted section. It's one of these things where like her goal is to save animals, right? To save as many animals as they possibly can. And so Peter actually ends up reaching into a container that holds an irradiated arachnid female. And of course, it bites him. When that happens, Mary Jane Watson, of course, has a rabbit. Because of the fact that they enter the room and basically started messing with stuff, it activated the entire alarm system and security shows up. And so while they're kind of being interred there, Mary Jane Watson's parents, of course, come and pick her up. Peter Parker's parents are dead, right? That's one of the things he says is like his parents are dead, and he basically lives with Uncle Ted, who's basically a stand-in for Uncle Ben because seemingly Aunt May's not really part of the picture, and we're not really given an explanation as to why his aunt's not there, but we can largely assume that they are basically separated, right? That they basically split up. And we'll get more of an explanation as to why that's the case here in a second. But Mary Jane Watson, having lived next to Peter Parker, is kind of like, look, like he can come home with us, right? I mean, they have to release him to like an adult guardian, but it's like, he can come home with us, it's fine, everything's gonna be cool. And so when he gets back home, that's when his Uncle Ted shows up. And what you end up finding out is that Peter Parker is the way that he is because of the abuse he sustains at the hands of his uncle. So for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with this kind of stuff, the old adage is that sociopaths are made and psychopaths are born. And for the most part, that's kind of old hat. That stuff doesn't really apply anymore. And even the terms sociopath and psychopath are considered antiquated terms that by and large, the notion of a psychopath versus a sociopath just kind of fall under the umbrella of antisocial personality disorder. And a lot of that's because the various attributes of the two cross over in a lot of ways, right? Like a psychopath lacks the ability to feel remorse. A psychopath lacks the ability to feel empathy. A sociopath can feel empathy, and where a psychopath may be a lot more controlled, a lot more manipulative, far more planning in their approach to different situations, sociopaths will be far more hot-headed, right? They'll be impulsive, different things like that. At the end of the day, both of them can be made, right? There are genetic components to a psychopath, but it's not necessarily that way. That Peter here looks to be a classic case of what we would call a sociopath, right? That he was made this way. And the reason why is because his Uncle Ted is highly abusive, right? That he considers Peter to basically be this kind of goofball, this kind of kid who's always problematic, and even goes as far as to say that he never should have let social services talk him into taking Peter in. And so he actually beats Peter. And while that's happening, because Mary Jane Watson lives across the street, she hears it happening, right? It brings tears to her eyes, but she hears Peter begging as if his uncle just beats him, right, on a daily basis. Now, when that happens, or at least following that, at least the next day anyway, the kind of impulses that Peter begins to experience as a result of the spider bite begin to manifest. Now, this is where things totally change, because in the main Marvel universe, and really most alternate reality stories that involve Peter Parker or some variation of Peter Parker, whether it's Spider-Gwen or somebody like that, the whole process of him becoming Spider-Man usually manifests in the fact that one, he feels more confident, he feels more energetic, right? Like as if he's just been working out his entire life and is just now feeling the effects of it, as well as the traditional things that you're used to seeing, him crawling on walls, his spider sense, different things along those lines. In this instance, whether it's because of his upbringing or something along those lines, the powers that begin to manifest actually fall in the range of more violent and dark abilities, right? In the sense that like he experiences a kind of hunger. And so as a result of this, he actually ends up grabbing a mouse that was caught in a mousetrap and essentially consumes it. Following that, he goes after a cat. And then in turn, when the cat scratches him and begins to get away, he ends up shooting his webbing by accident, realizing that he has it, ensnares the cat, and then realizes he can make a kind of home for himself, right? In the same way that a spider will fashion a web, Peter begins the same thing here. And so what ends up happening is later on that night, of course, Uncle Ted comes home and things happen exactly as you would expect them to, right? And some of you might have been watching this like, yeah, man, it's about time Uncle Ted got his due, right? So ultimately, when Uncle Ted comes in, of course, the lights are out, the whole thing's done. He's pissed off that Peter doesn't have dinner ready. When he gets into his room, he basically finds all these different just kind of cocoon type things, right? Basically all these animals from around the neighborhood that have basically been ensnared by Peter that he's essentially saving as meals. And that's what spiders do, right? Spiders will catch an object or catch a thing that shows up in their web, or at least activates their web. They'll ensnare it, and then sometimes they'll eat it immediately. Other times they'll store it for later use. But regardless, Peter's just laying in wait, basically attached to his ceiling, and then immediately goes after his Uncle Ted, right? Now, following that, you basically end up picking up with him as he's making his way to school. And of course, you've got all these posters for missing cats and different things along those lines, right? Animals that had vanished. And then Flash Thompson shows up, right? Flash Thompson starts giving him a hard time, having no idea that Peter is basically eating a bird that he had kept away in his locker, which is really kind of weird. But with Flash Thompson giving him a hard time, kind of making fun of him, that sort of a thing, you know, ultimately Peter kind of does exactly what you've seen over the course of the traditional Spider-Man mythos, where he stands up to Flash Thompson with this new vow of confidence. The difference here is that unlike Peter, who usually gets in some kind of a fight with Flash, overpowers him, and then basically demonstrates, I'm not someone to be trifled with, in this instance, he kills Flash Thompson and he eats him. Right now, you don't actually see it happen. Instead, it's alluded to, right? Flash says, like, you won't be laughing when I wipe that grin off your face with my fist. And then in turn, Peter's like, you know, well, name a time and a place. And Flash says, okay, well then how about during lunch, right? Out in like the locker room. And so it's like, lunch? That sounds perfect, right? And so given what we've seen so far, Peter's basically going to eat Flash Thompson. Now, following that, of course, again, after school, making his way back to his home, he ends up coming across a kid who's putting up a poster looking for his pet. Peter leads him back to his house and then ultimately seems to consume that kid as well. And so all this comes to a head with Mary Jane showing up at his house last night. And the reason why is because Flash Thompson hasn't shown up, right? She doesn't know where he is. He usually always calls, that kind of a thing. And Peter kind of dismisses it insofar as just being like, I mean, what do you ever see in that guy anyway, right? You know, and it's kind of like, you know, the guy was always a jerk. Like, why would you date somebody like him, you know? And so there is almost kind of a romantic moment, right? With this sort of new confidence that Peter has. Again, much like you would normally see in the main Spider-Man mythos, he makes a move on Mary Jane Watson. The difference here is that after kissing her, he immediately bites her. And of course, with that in mind, when she smacks him and just basically knocks away part of the skin on his face, you actually see what he's ended up becoming under his skin, that he is basically a giant human spider. I mean, he's got like 8 eyes and just like these mandibles coming out of his mouth and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? Of course, Mary Jane Watson is terrified for her life, ends up stumbling into his room to find his uncle strapped to the bed. Peter's basically just been feeding on him all this time. And then the kid that he had kidnapped earlier is basically strung upside down, with Peter having the intention to feed on him at a later date, right? I mean, I told you guys, man, this story gets dark, dude. It is dark. Now, the funny thing about this is that in this whole process, as Mary Jane is trying to like get away from Peter, right? He's kind of stalking her a little bit and she's begging for her life. And he's like, look, I wouldn't hurt you. Like, why would I kill you? You know, that's never going to happen. You know, like, you know, he's like, today, like, I'm a carrier, right? You're going to be the mother of my children. And that's when you end up finding out that what he had done with Uncle Ted is he had actually deposited spider eggs in him. And all those spider eggs just come pouring out of him, right? His mouth, his ears, his eyes, the whole 9 yards, just come dumping out of this guy. They immediately go and try to basically swarm to Mary Jane. And then of course, that basically leads to the arrival of Morlun. Now, here's the thing about this. This again kind of ties into the nature of Spider-Verse, that Morlun is one of the inheritors. And what these guys are doing is just traveling around the multiverse, killing everybody who is basically some variation of Spider-Man. Doesn't matter who they are or what they are. And that's kind of the irony behind this, is because under normal circumstances, when you look at the edge of Spider-Verse stories, or even the lead up to Spider-Verse, that Morlun was basically a bad guy, right? Killing these Spider-Men who were heroes, who were just trying to do the right thing. In this instance, he's kind of more of a good guy, right? Now, he's a good guy by circumstance. It's not as though he somehow changed his tune and decided to become a hero, killing off all the different evil Spider-Men across the multiverse. It just happens to be this is a universe where Peter Parker ended up becoming some giant twisted version of a human spider and was about to kill Mary Jane, and he showed up and just happened to rescue her, right? The funny thing about this is that when you're talking about somebody like Morlun, and this is something that we've seen consistently, this dude's on a whole different level. This kid, right? I mean, he's only been Spider-Man, or at least been a Spider-Man-esque character for like a couple days or something like that. So quite literally, Morlun tears this kid apart. I mean, he rips his arm off, he tears the mandibles out of his face. I mean, he just wrecks this kid, right? And then in turn just absorbs all the life force from him and basically kills him in the process. And so following that, what you end up doing is picking up with Mary Jane Watson the next day. And so as she's kind of getting ready for school and all that kind of stuff, you basically end up having her looking at this bite that she has from Peter Parker, and then suddenly there's movement, only for a baby spider to crawl out, and suddenly for like all these spiders to come dumping out of this opening, presumably to consume Mary Jane Watson alive. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Yeah, man, this is dark. And I will catch you all later. Peace.